Hello, everyone. Welcome to this conversation on the Black Lives Matter movement. In this conversation, we're going to look at the emergence of Black Lives Matter as a movement, the message of the movement, and the Christian response to Black Lives Matter. So I want to begin with this question: why Black Lives Matter? Why, in the 2020s, are we asking this question? Why are we saying Black Lives Matter? Uh, in the last decade. Why is that still a question? Why is that something that would need to be said? And why has it become such a controversial thing? John Perkins, in his book Let Justice Roll Down, said in situations of inequality or oppression, the oppressed group must take a stand somewhere, sometime, for until the people take that stand, there is no development possible for them. Yet when they take that stand in the face of clear injustice, an oppressed people are once again humanized, and they then become capable of a level of development, spiritual, economic, social, or other, not psychologically possible for a people still in a passive, dependent state. I think what Perkins is saying here is very important. Um, why are we talking about Black Lives Matter? Why are we saying such a thing at this time in our history? And that's because a group of people have recognized that there's something deeply flawed in our system that has caused Black Americans to be treated differently than everyone else in our society. But it goes deeper than that. It goes to the realization that when you allow that to exist within a society, that you are essentially hindering the development of a group of people. That you are, when you keep people in a passive state of acceptance of things that are not normal for everyone else, you are hindering their opportunity to move forward alongside of everyone else in society. I think it's a very, very important thing to understand. And then we must also understand that there are many folks out there that resist that thinking, that are resistant of the idea that there's something wrong, that something needs to change, that something significant is going on, that's a problem, and that it needs to be addressed. So what is the catalyst of the Black Lives Matter movement? Well, there's this event in 1991 in Los Angeles, California, involving Rodney King that kind of sets the stage for the movement that emerged a couple of decades later. Rodney King had been involved in a DUI. He had fled. He was captured, beaten by the police. Four police officers savagely beat him in the streets of Los Angeles, and it was videoed. And that's really the critical element here. Cameras and video, we saw with Rodney King in 1991, is going to change the dynamic of this conversation in a very significant way. Um, the officers who beat Rodney King were all ultimately acquitted of charges. And so we kind of see the formation of the types of things that are going to become a problem in this conversation of Black Lives Matter. But the actual event that was the catalyst of the movement involves Trayvon Martin, who was killed in February of 2012 in Florida by George Zimmerman. Trayvon Martin was a black youth who was walking through a neighborhood wearing a hoodie. George Zimmerman was a neighborhood watch type of person. He wasn't actually a police officer, and he saw Martin and suspected him of some criminal activity and followed him and then chased him, and then ultimately they got in an altercation and Trayvon Martin was killed by George Zimmerman. Zimmerman was put on trial for murder and in July of 2013 was acquitted of those charges. And the result of that event was that Alicia Garza and two others created a hashtag. It was a simple hashtag that said Black Lives Matter. And it is from this event that we get the emergence of the Black Lives Matter movement. Now, there are other incidents that are going to follow that are going to be a part of this movement. In 2014, Eric Garner is killed in New York by the police. He is choked. Mike Brown is killed by police in Ferguson, Missouri in 2014. Tamir Rice is killed in Cleveland that same year. In 2015, Walter Scott is killed by the police in Charleston, South Carolina. Freddie Gray is detained by the police in Baltimore and dies in police custody in 2015. And then in 2016, Philando Castile is killed by the police. His girlfriend famously videoed, live streamed after he was pulled over and shot during a traffic stop. And later that year, Colin Kaepernick kneeled in protest of these events during the national anthem. And then, of course, we have the events of 2020, Ahmaud Arbery being killed while he's jogging in Brunswick, Georgia, Breonna Taylor killed in Louisville when the police mistakenly invaded the wrong home. She's shot by accident as she sleeps in a bedroom, and George Floyd, obviously, killed in Minneapolis, Minnesota, all in 2020. So what are the sort of main elements of these incidents? Because I think it's very important to understand these, to try to understand the context of Black Lives Matter. Essentially, in all of these incidents, you see a kind of a general pattern. You see a minor offense. All of these incidents involve something minor. People accused of stealing cigarettes or a box of cigars or selling fake cigarettes or a minor traffic violation or something like that. And then normally you have some form of resistance. And again, it's a black person that is accused of some sort of minor offense. They resist in some way, not always. There's not always resistance, but sometimes there would be resistance. But there is always some sort of extraordinary police response that goes way beyond what you would think would be a normal response based on the offense that someone is suspected of committing. And then fourth, most of the time you have video. Not always, but most of the time you have some sort of video of the event, and that sparks then protests. And the protests are mostly peaceful. It depends on the event. But usually they follow a pattern where they start peaceful sometimes, and often they remain peaceful the entire time. And then also, though, as we know, they sometimes turn violent as well. What is the fundamental issue here? I think this statistic is important. We've talked about this before. Black men are 2.5 times more likely to be killed by the police than white men. And there's some reason for that, and there is obviously a problem associated with that. And obviously these events are drawing attention to that. I think the other thing we should remember about these events is that all of them provoke for Black Americans some sort of connection to other events they've experienced, other events that are not videotaped, other events that are not national news. And I think that's important to not think that the Black Lives Matter is really about one particular event, because it never really was about one event, and it isn't about one event. So what is the message of Black Lives Matter? What is the message of the slogan Black Lives Matter, of the movement? And that's important because if there's ever been a movement where the message has been confused, it has been the Black Lives Matter movement. Because if you would ask some people on the street, especially people of different races, you're going to come up with a lot of different ideas of what this movement actually means, what the slogan actually means. So what is the message of Black Lives Matter? But we're going to try to understand the message of Black Lives Matter by looking at the words of Alicia Garza, who created the hashtag and then later wrote a book called The Purpose of Power. And so the first thing we're going to look at is that Garza said it's important to understand that declaring that Black Lives Matter does not negate the significance of the lives of non-Black people, particularly non-Black people of color. But Black lives are uniquely and systematically attacked in our society. Black Lives Matter addresses its own necessity in the phrase itself. Black lives do not have value or merit in our society. And so what Garza is saying, I think, is the simplest way of understanding Black Lives Matter. It is to say, it's really those words. We're saying Black Lives Matter. And that suggests that Black lives have not always mattered in our society. And I think in this course, we have clearly demonstrated that that is the case, that Black lives have not always mattered the way other lives in our society have mattered. And this raises a very important question because one of the responses to Black Lives Matter was for a bunch of people to start saying Blue Lives Matter, referring to the police. And that's very interesting because I think the disconnect there is that blue lives have always mattered in our society. Our society has always respected the police. It's just like the way we treat other people in our society that are respected. We respect and appreciate nurses in our society. The nurses have always mattered. We respect and appreciate lots of people in our society, and we revere them. Blue lives have been revered in our society. Garza is saying, we're not saying that she's not saying that anybody else's life doesn't matter. She's saying Black lives matter. Let's draw attention to that. Let's recognize that they have not always mattered, and we're saying today, Black lives matter. The second quote I want to look at from Garza is when she said, I learned that racism, like most systems of oppression, isn't about bad people doing terrible things to people who are different from them, but instead is a way of maintaining power for certain groups at the expense of others. So I think the second element of the Black Lives Matter message is the idea that racism is a way of maintaining power for certain groups of people. It's more than just an individual act of injustice. It's more than just a personal thing. That it's a group thing. It's a way to maintain power that's perpetrated by one group on another group. And then the third quote is Garza wrote, diversity is what happens when you have representation of various groups in one place. Representation is what happens when groups that haven't previously been included are included. Intersectionality is what happens when we do everything through the lens of making sure that no one is left behind. More than surface level inclusion or merely making sure everyone is represented, intersectionality is the practice of interrogating the power dynamics and rationales of how we can be together. So Garza is saying that diversity is when you have different groups of people in one place. Representation is when those groups have not been included or allowed into and to be represented within those groups. Intersectionality, and this is really the third aspect, I think, of at least Garza's thinking, is when we do everything through the lens of making sure that no one is left behind. It's the intentional and proactive interrogation of the effects of our power dynamics. So it's recognizing that racism is a power issue and then saying we are going to aggressively pursue racism within our power dynamic and our systems. So to kind of summarize the message of Black Lives Matter, it's that Black lives have not always mattered, and we are going to say now Black Lives Matter. It is looking at racism as a way of maintaining power for certain groups. And then it is intersectionality or critical race theory. It is the intentional and proactive interrogation of the effects of our power dynamics. So Black Lives Matters. Black lives have not always mattered, um, and they have not always mattered because of racism and the power structures in society that allow racism to continue to exist and to continue to hold one group or treat one group differently than everyone else. And then it's intersectionality, the intentional and proactive interrogation of the effects of our power dynamics. In other words, we're going to aggressively look at how these power dynamics are affecting different groups of people, and try to do the systemic changes that are necessary to fix the problem. So I want to go a little deeper on both intersectionality and critical race theory because they're very certainly they're talked about an awful lot these days, and so we need to come to terms with what these things actually mean. Intersectionality is an analytical framework for understanding how aspects of a person's social and political identities combine or intersect to create different modes of discrimination and privilege. It's a framework for understanding how the different experiences of a person socially and politically and how they see themselves fitting into society combine or intersect. So that word intersect is important. How the different identities you have intersect with each other and within your society to create different modes of discrimination and privilege. And so one good example of that is something that people that talk about intersectionality discuss, which is triple oppression. And basically, they're saying that when you're a minority and you're poor and an immigrant, these three identities that society gives you um, intersect with each other, and you end up with what people would call triple oppression. In other words, you're affected. Now that's a very aggressive word, obviously, but you're affected, and I think we would all agree to this, that those three identities intersect with each other, and you're affected differently than someone that's, say, poor and just white. And obviously, you can be oppressed because you're poor and white, but if you're an immigrant, that adds another level of issue to your identity. And if you're a minority, that's also going to add another level. And if you're female, that's going to add a different level. And this is not necessarily to say that that it's always um, that we can establish some sort of value to this, but what intersectionality is saying, we need to recognize that these people are affected on multiple levels by the intersection of their social and political identities. Critical race theory, again, a term that's extremely popular now these days, both for those that advance critical race theory and for those who aggressively oppose it. What does it mean? It means that race is a socially constructed, culturally invented category that is used to oppress and exploit people of color. That's the broader understanding of critical race theory. Critical race theory actually emerged decades ago, and essentially it was a movement to look at the law of our country and other countries to see where the law, to look critically at the law, to see where the law is part of this social construct that is used to oppress and exploit people of color. So to look at the law and to see where, even though it might not clearly state something like we don't want black people voting, the law may not say that, but it could have the effect of oppressing black votes or black voters in some way. And so we want to look at the law to see where its effects might be oppressive and exploitive of people of color, because critical race theorists believe that race itself is a social construct, a category that is used to oppress and exploit people of color. And so we want to look at the parts of our system that would essentially be affected by this. So that's critical race theory. So obviously, intersectionality and critical race theory are the more controversial of the aspects of the message of Black Lives Matter. I think if we think back through that message, certainly the greater number of Americans are going to agree that Black Lives Matter, and that maybe we should be saying that there's been a problem with that and we should address it. Fewer people are going to agree with the idea of racism as power rather than as an individual action. And even fewer people are going to agree with the idea of that for many is going to look very radical, which is the ideas of intersectionality and critical race theory and the attempts to address the systemic issues or to talk about this on a systemic level. Another issue that is controversial and that makes the Black Lives Matter movement controversial is the organization of Black Lives Matter. And if you can actually call it that, I probably should have put that word organization in quotation marks to help us to understand this better. So the Black Lives Matter movement, I think it's important to know three things about it. The first is it's decentralized. At the beginning, this hashtag that Garza created really led to a bunch of decentralized local chapters being established throughout the country. It was very easy to do it. These are people just simply rallying around a slogan rather than really a core set of beliefs or ideas. I mean, the slogan is its own belief, obviously, and its own statement. And because of that, you end up with like several organizations out there that would claim to be Black Lives Matter. I don't even know if we can actually say there is one organization. And that's why I use quotes from Garza as my way to explain the broader understanding of the message of Black Lives Matter. There's no clear hierarchy within the organization, within these various groups. And because of that, so because it's so decentralized, we end up with diverse messages. And so some of these groups are going to advocate for LGBTQ rights. And some of them are going to demonstrate socialist tendencies. And some of them are going to be arguing to defund the police. Others are not. And so these messages, especially the defunding of the police, have become extremely controversial and have really provoked a lot of blowback on the movement because of not the actual core message of Black Lives Matter, and that we should say that and we should try to make that true in America. But some other conversation, again, like defunding the police. So the second thing about Black Lives Matter that's important is that because of its decentralization, the movement ends up having diverse messages. And the last thing that's important to understand that is it is a movement that is its leadership and those who end up speaking for it are tend to be secular. We know the Black church had a powerful presence in the leadership of the civil rights movement. It was a central factor in the civil rights movement. That is not true with the Black Lives Matter organization itself. It is the leaders of Black Lives Matter tend to be much more secular, tend to be not involved or not the leaders of the Black church. The Black church has been more detached. Now, that's not to say that the Black church is not part of Black Lives Matter or doesn't support Black Lives Matter. It's just not the leader of the Black Lives Matter organization, as it was with the civil rights movement itself. So, what is the proper Christian response to Black Lives Matter? How would you expect Christian leaders the Christian community to respond to the Black Lives Matter movement. One of the strongest responses to the Black Lives Matter movement is that of the United Methodist Church, that one of their publications put forward in 2020. And it said this: "Our belief that Black lives are created in the image of God inspires us to say, Black Lives Matter. Now is the time to act. We call on United Methodists to work for the elimination of racism in all its forms, institutional and personal. Partner with elected officials and law enforcement to end racial profiling of Black and Brown communities. Advocate for the rights of formerly incarcerated persons and for humane systems of restorative justice. Urge white United Methodists and majority white local churches to confront their white privilege and repent for their participation in a culture of racist practices. Share conferences work undoing the culture of hate and name hate crimes in their conference bounds." And then it finishes with this quote: "Not only is to be silent to be complicit, it is to abandon our baptismal vows." And so this statement by the United Methodist Church in 2020 is about the strongest statement that that a denomination could possibly give on the issue. So they're saying we should say Black Lives Matter, we should address it on a personal issue, we should address issues of racism within ourselves, we should address them on systemic levels, and that essentially to be silent, not to actually be racist, but simply to be silent, is not just to be complicit, but it's to abandon our baptismal vows. This is a very encompassing statement issued in 2020 by the United Methodist Church. And so you have that statement by the United Methodist Church in 2020. The Presbyterian Church USA issued a similar statement in 2020. The Southern Baptist Convention, probably one of the most reluctant organizations to come alongside of the Black Lives Matter movement in 2020. Its president, J.D. Greear, said, "We support the slogan, not the organization, not some of the other elements that we've been talking to, probably not the systemic issues, but certainly the slogan of the movement." And so these statements, all in 2020, obviously in response to the rioting and the peaceful protests and rioting that occurred in the wake of these significant events of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and George Floyd in 2020. But this is not the first time that leadership within significant denominations has spoken. The Assemblies of God in 1989, decades ago, issued a statement that said said we need to combat racism on individual and structural systemic levels, and so they were out in front of this issue. In 2015, Illinois Catholic Bishop Edward K. Braxton issued a pastoral letter, and it spoke to again, the personal and structural issues, and also looked inside the Catholic Church for some of its complicity with racism and addressed that. So you have lots of strong voices there. The situation with Catholics, I think, is something that helps us to understand, though, the complexity of this, because in all of these cases, you're going to have leadership take a strong position, but you're also going to have the reality of a lot of controversy that's going to develop within the denominations. And so within Catholicism, the controversy is not a question so much of personal or systemic issues. It's the statute controversy, because in 2020, when the peaceful protests turned violent, a lot of that violence ended up in tearing down things like Confederate monuments and stuff like that, but also a lot of Roman Catholic statues were torn down. And that's very offensive to Roman Catholics, because the Roman Catholic faith is, those statues are sacred, to Roman Catholics. And so there's some blowback against the Black Lives Matter within Roman Catholicism because of issues involving tearing down statues. Now, not all groups have been supportive. White evangelicals, only about 13% of white evangelicals support the entire message of Black Lives Matter. Maybe a larger group might support the slogan itself, but there's been historically a lot of reluctance by white evangelicals. And again, many of those in the South, especially, part of the Southern Baptist Convention, are going to be very um, reluctant to support. And there's also a cancel culture that developed within the Christian community. Um, Several black leaders, Lecrae, who was a Christian singer, Pastor Thabiti Anyabwile, and Michelle Higgins, all spoke out very aggressively with regard to Black Lives Matter, and often is the case is within the especially white evangelical circles, when you speak out, you lose financial support, you lose people buying your music, sometimes you lose your job, and so there's also this blowback against people. Russell Moore will be an example of a white evangelical who spoke out on these issues and has experienced some canceling, people wanting him to lose his job within the Southern Baptist Convention. Now, much of this is within white evangelical spaces, and in particular, one of the things we have to note is that there's northern white evangelicals and there's southern white evangelicals. The white evangelicals in the north are going to tend to be much more progressive, and things like the Christianity Today magazine will be part of those groups of people that would tend to agree with the need for personal and systemic issues and be more supportive of the Black Lives Matter. And then you have Southern white evangelicals represented more from the Southern Baptist Convention and other groups like that that are going to be pushing back. But the thing I want to point out here is that you have strong responses by leadership, but you still have controversy within the responses and within the community. So I want to take a moment and break down the framework of opposition to Black Lives Matter. Those who, within the Christian community, who oppose Black Lives Matter begin with the assumption that racism only involves overt individual acts, such as slurs or exclusion from groups or organizations. So they would push back on systemic conversation. They say that racism is really about a personal choice by someone to sin, and they would be against racism. They would support the idea that Black lives should matter, but they would see it not as a systemic, but as a personal issue. And so from that comes the concept of accountable individualism, the idea that every person must be held accountable as an individual. We hold individuals accountable. We hold people accountable. And then from that, you get the idea of anti-structuralism, the looking at the system, not through the lens of how we need to restructure the system. The idea is that the system itself is not the issue, that we don't see problems and or solutions within systems. That and in effect, a lot of people that resist Black Lives Matter are what we call anti-structural. They don't see systems as as the issue. What they see is systems and any attempts to find systemic solutions as actually the problem. Is that when you try to address problems through systems, you actually create more problems. They are anti-structuralist in nature. And so the solution for these folks is what we call relationalism. The solution to race problems is individual conversion. It's teaching people about Jesus, and it's building relationships with people. And the downside of that, and so the idea is that you are teaching people to make better personal decisions. And so if you convert people to Christianity, you build relationships between people of different races, we will start to live out our faith. And as a result of that, racism will simply come to an end naturally. The problem with that is that these folks tend to be ignorant of systemic issues that create advantage or disadvantage because it's not even really on their radar. They don't even really have a true sense of the importance of these things, and so they are not going to see systemic reform as a true solution to the problem. Relationalism is the solution to the problem in their view. And then we kind of see this all come together in the 2016 election of Donald Trump. It's just a very interesting dynamic to try to understand. Donald Trump was a candidate for president who demonstrated racial insensitivity. And a lot of people obviously have called Donald Trump a racist. I think we need to be careful with that. We don't know if an individual is a racist or not. He said on many occasions that he is not. But what we do know about Donald Trump is that he is racially insensitive. And so at times he uses words and phrases that are racially stereotypical. He was accused when he was renting apartments as a realtor in New York of discriminating against blacks in renting apartments. He called for the reinstitution of the death penalty for the Central Park Five. These were black men accused of raping and killing a white woman in Central Park. These men were later acquitted. He called immigrants addicts and rapists. He called black countries shithole countries. And he was slow to denounce the white supremacist actions in Charlottesville. And then finally, he supported a ban on Muslim travel to America. And so when you take these all together, you certainly could argue that as a candidate for president and as a president, Donald Trump was racially insensitive. But despite this racial insensitivity, and I think this is really important, major religious leaders, again, many of them supportive of the group that opposes the Black Lives Matter movement organization, not the slogan necessarily, but the larger movement. Guys like Franklin Graham, Jerry Falwell Jr., Pat Robertson, James Dobson, these are people with large platforms, all came on board and supported the presidency of Donald Trump. 81% of white evangelicals voted for Donald Trump. That was the group of Christians most strongly supportive of the Trump candidacy. But 58% of Protestants in general supported Donald Trump when they voted, and 60% of white Catholics also voted for Donald Trump. So I think it's important to kind of look at that and understand that I think that kind of fits in with some of the conversations that we have been having in this course, and how even in the context of the Black Lives Matter movement and understanding the dynamics of people's response to that, understanding that the election of Donald Trump certainly demonstrates that we are still accepting racial insensitivity, that we are willing to make a political decision that benefits us in other ways, and kind of look the other way on these issues as we have in the past. So in summary, in this conversation on the Black Lives Matter movement, we've talked about the emergence of the movement, the message of the movement, and the Christian response to the Black Lives Matter movement. Some questions to consider from this conversation. What are the moral implications of black men being 2.5 times more likely to be killed by the police than white men? Should Christians say Black Lives Matter? Why or why not? Should Christians support the intersectionality, and should they support intersectionality and or critical race theory? Why or why not? What are the moral implications of relationalism? Thanks for joining our conversation today. God bless you and have a great day.